So hello, everyone. My name is Yeva Jumbida, and I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Brown University. Today, we are very delighted to have Professor Karen Coelho with us at the Center for Contemporary South Asia. Even though it's virtually, we are happy to be able to make this connection. So Karen Coelho is an associate professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies based in Chennai, India. She's an anthropologist with a PhD from the University of Arizona. She has researched the city of Chennai for nearly 20 years, focusing on ethnographic and critical examinations of urban infrastructure, such as water and housing, informal settlements and resettlement schemes, and the eco-restoration of rivers, canals, and tanks. She has published articles and books in numerous outlets, and she's a co-editor of the book Participolis, Consent and Contention in Neoliberal Urban India. Professor Coelho also serves on the editorial advisory board on several journals, including Review of Urban Affairs and Economic and Political Weekly of India. Going beyond her academic accomplishments and engagements, she is also a member of the drafting committee for the Housing and Habitat Policy and the Housing Advisory Committee for the Government of Tamil Nadu. Welcome to Brown again, Professor Coelho. I'm turning over to you. We look forward to your presentation, after which we will have a Q&A discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel really privileged to be here at this, giving this seminar, and I want to thank Brown University's Center for Contemporary South Asia and the Watson Institute, and I'd say a special thanks to Yeva Zumbite and Stephanie Abbott and Grace Cardonio, who sort of, got this off the ground for me and really saw me through, getting here. Thanks. So maybe I should start sharing my screen right away. Okay. Right, you can all see it? Okay.
Perfect.
So I've been doing research in resettlement colonies of Chennai for, I would say, a decade now. And I know there are a lot of other scholars also researching resettlement in different cities in this country. And so what I'm trying to do in this paper is really an attempt to think resettlement at a nationwide, although it is even actually a more global southern urban form, but I thought I'd think about it as a nationwide sort of urban phenomenon, and to explore what this would mean then to think about resettlement, and also what it would imply for the character of contemporary urbanization in India. And I think there's a lot still that needs to be developed in my thinking in this, but I'm offering this as a work in progress. This is a paper I've very recently written, so here we are. A new urban marginality. So if you look at these images, they're from different cities. There's Mumbai, Ahmedabad, and Chennai. But these images are so standard and uniform, they could be really from any big city of India. I mean, I just want you to note the very standard kind of look imagery here. So there are these shoddy, multi-storied buildings ranged in repetitive lines across vast tracts of territory. These landscapes can be found off the corridors connecting India's big cities to their metropolitan peripheries, hidden behind luxury residential enclaves, industrial warehouses, or municipal waste mountains. These are resettlement colonies, sites of mass formal low-income housing that have emerged on metropolitan peripheries across the country over the past 2 decades. Sited on lands of low economic value because they are flood-prone, hazardous, or polluted, they house a concentration of vulnerable urban populations, informal workers from low castes, ethnic or religious minorities, or migrants. I argue that these projects redefine the social geographies and institutional practices of urban marginality. Now, resettlement itself is defined as a form of compensatory assistance for the growing numbers of people displaced by development projects, typically has been studied in the context of dams or irrigation projects. But here I discuss a specific kind of resettlement, the removal of propertyless urban households en masse from cities to planned settlements on their peripheries in order to clear slums and improve the living conditions of their inhabitants. So this form of resettlement has emerged as a dominant mode of urban restructuring in India since the 2000s, and it fulfills two key imperatives of urban renewal. First, the urgent upscaling of low-income housing stock to meet the vast shortage identified by official studies. And second, the rehousing of urban dwellers, slum dwellers, evicted from cities for various infrastructure, transport, or eco-restoration projects, and more recently for climate adaptation plans. In this sense, then resettlement has become a development project in its own right, fulfilling multiple urban development, urban governance objectives, including formalizing informal settlements, alleviating poverty, integrating informal workers into formal markets, and disciplining them through new obligations of taxes, service fees, and responsibilities for management and maintenance of their neighborhoods through resident association. So what I'm saying now is that as a dominant nationwide model of social housing in India, mass peripheral resettlement has overwritten specific local histories and legacies of affordable housing and slum clearance in different cities, in particular the auto-constructive and integrative approaches like Ahmedabad's slum networking project that experimented with in-situ upgrading in the 1990s, or Chennai's sites and services schemes of the 1980s. Now, all of these were, had very different approaches, but right now we just have pretty much this one, apart from the Mumbai's SRS models. Now, what explains this concerted national shift in housing solutions for the urban poor? I invoke four interlinked features of India's urban turn of the 2000s. First, the reframing of India's cities as engines of national economic growth pivots on the financialization of urban land to attract global capital, leading to speculative markets and steep rises in land prices. Second, the agenda of urban renewal has invigorated efforts to supply low-income housing at a rapidly enhanced pace and scale, enabled by a series of Housing for All and Slum-Free Cities missions that have brought substantial grant funding from the central government. Now, despite variations in approach and emphasis, all these schemes focus on constructing new stock in the form of small units in multi-storied tenements, rather than upgrading existing stock. And of course, the so-called dearth of affordable housing, affordable urban land then pushes these new housing projects to low-priced lands on the peripheries. Third, urban renewal has entrenched new regimes of what has variably been termed bourgeois environmentalism, aesthetic governance, social municipalism, all of which index a convergence among state agencies, corporations, and elite civil society around agendas of sanitizing and beautifying cities, which then translate into a mounting intolerance of informal settlement in the city. And an important new ingredient in this conjunctural moment is the valorization of urban water bodies as ecological as well as real estate assets for waterfront development, leisure, and beautification. Eco-restoration projects, increasingly spurred by court orders, selectively target informal settlements as encroachers and polluters, and have emerged as among the most powerful catalysts of exclusion in Indian cities. All of these processes together, and I'm kind of generalizing very broadly here, I would say brought an end to the era of squatter mobilization across big Indian cities. And in the mid-2000s, you see slum eviction drives of unprecedented scale and ferocity across India's major cities, or the Sabarmati river banks in Ahmedabad, the Yamuna River in Delhi, the Miti River in Mumbai, and the Kuam River in Chennai. And varying proportions of evicted families then get sent to these resettlement colonies. Resettlement thus represents two convergent strands of urban salvage missions, one of ecological restoration and the other of slum-free cities. Now, another important moment in the entrenchment of resettlement as the dominant solution to slums and urban poverty was the launch of India's first National Urban Renewal Mission, the JNNURM, in 2005. Its sub-mission, Basic Services for the Urban Poor, BSUP, became the first concerted nationwide vehicle for social housing. Under its Housing for All schemes, it financed a proliferation of tenement colonies on India's metropolitan peripheries. In Chennai, more than 80% of BSUP funds were spent on constructing peripheral resettlement tenements. In Ahmedabad, the BSUP reawakened the trend of publicly provided housing that had remained stagnant from 1981. And in Ahmedabad, 2/3 of the 20,000 odd BSUP units constructed here were located on the peripheries, and all were used to resettle households displaced by the Sabarmati Riverfront project, the bus rapid transit system, and various road, flyovers, and bridge projects. This trend of peripheralization has intensified with new generations of centrally funded social housing programs like the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, which drives public sector participation in affordable housing. These funding schemes, the PMA and the BSUP, have also produced resettlement colonies as a supply-driven housing solution, where tens of thousands of tenements are constructed in anticipation of large-scale displacements from the city and settled in phases based on the eviction schedules of infrastructure projects. And importantly, while these projects include stock for purchase by low-income households seeking affordable home ownership, the vast majority have been appropriated to resettle forcibly evicted households. And thus, eviction fundamentally shapes the meanings and experiences of resettlement, of offsetting the advantages of this formal serviced housing with a number of serious losses of livelihoods, social networks, and mobility entailed by the displacement. The resettlement constitutes a moment of rupture, forcing families to rebuild their lives and resources from scratch under extremely adverse conditions. So what I'm then arguing in this talk is that despite some blurred categorical boundaries and a degree of internal difference, urban resettlement constitutes a singular and distinctive socio-spatial phenomenon across India, and for that matter, across many countries of the global South. I outline commonalities in their dynamics and effects across different Indian cities, drawing on a set of studies from Delhi, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, and Chennai. Just quickly show you, these are the studies. There's 3 studies from Delhi, 3 from Chennai, 2 from Mumbai, 2 from Ahmedabad that I've reviewed for this. To argue that despite goals of inclusion and formalization, resettlement colonies produce effects of peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection of their residents from the urban mainstream. They are sites of structural violence that severely constrain residents' opportunities for socioeconomic advancement, and they reproduce marginalization, stigma, and threat. Yet I also show how, when viewed through extended temporalities of settling and remaking lives in these colonies, resettlement emerges as a complex of anomalies and ambiguities, wherein formalization coexists with and co-produces informalities of various kinds, and where marginality is countered by residents' ongoing claims and assertions of entitlement. And then next, I attempt to offer a conceptual framework for understanding urban peripheral resettlement as a form of differential inclusion, which affects what I call a settlement between the state's dual imperatives of reclaiming land for urban projects of accumulation on one hand, and accommodating excluded populations that have long pressed their claims through political means. Differential inclusion thus incorporates subaltern subjects into a tiered and unequal order. This form of marginality, I argue, is held in place by everyday practices of indifference that inflect the relationships between state service providers and these beneficiaries of subsidized housing, thereby maintaining and reproducing the stigma of these places and people. So resettlement colonies then as a type. Studies of resettlement colonies across India highlight striking consistencies in their features, dynamics, and effects, suggesting a singular and distinctive phenomenon despite differences in size, settings, and aspects of their governance. Each settlement is thus a place, but also a type, characterized by these 3 dynamics: peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection, that capture the effects of resettlement across different sites. Now, urban resettlement is really not new. Moving slum dwellers outside cities has long been part of the repertoire of strategies through which cities were sanitized and renewed from the days of the city improvement trusts from the late 19th century onwards. But these efforts were scattered and relatively small scale. But the one notorious instance of large scale evictions, namely the removal of over 700,000 slum dwellers from Delhi during the emergency in the 1970s, was I argue, a violent banishment that was actually quite different from the formal rehousing that contemporary resettlement programs represent. These social housing solutions, as Anand and Radamaka observed, represent a compact between a regime increasingly determined to remove slums within progressive rubrics of urban restructuring and informal residents forced in response to commute their long-fought political battles for squatter rights into negotiations for better terms of compensation and rehousing. So even as the courts in the 2000s became increasingly unsympathetic towards the claims of squatters, state administrators drew up ambitious plans to rehouse evicted slum dwellers in rapid, cost-effective, and scaled-up modes to keep the engine of urban growth running smoothly. So then what marks this contemporary phenomenon, I argue, is a combination of scale and policy intent. Urban resettlement in India today comprises large-scale, systematic, and well-funded operations to rehouse informal settlers and planned and service sites to integrate them into mainstream agendas of urban renewal and world-class city making. The policy framework of inclusion is thus a constitutive and defining feature of this phenomenon, drawing from a global consensus that links tenure security and improved housing conditions to poverty alleviation. Now, tenure security takes various forms, from 10-year licenses in Delhi to 20-year hire purchase agreements in Chennai, and all of these have prohibitions on renting or sales in the interim. But despite these conditionalities, these agreements endow their holders with a sense of ownership, or as Ban et al. Put it, the feeling rather than just the fact of holding and building property rights. So formalization affords residents a set of protections and promises, including that of a concrete constructed home with entitlement to state provided services and a new relationship with the state. Resettlement colonies are presented as integrated townships with all amenities from water, sanitation, electricity, and roads to schools, childcare, health facilities, playgrounds. As part of a neoliberal paradigm of inclusion, they envisaged the transformation of slum dwellers into citizen consumers by integrating them into municipal services and formal markets and into entrepreneurial subjects through skills training for self-employed occupations. Yet, resettlement has rarely, if ever, launched a simple pathway of advancement for its subjects. Instead, it has produced distinctive new complexes of disadvantage that have inhibited the physical and socioeconomic mobility of their residents, blocked their integration into the urban mainstream, and created islands of exception or ghettos. Now, there are some important differences, I would say, among resettlement colonies in India. First, while the vast majority comprise ready-built tenement housing, a few like Savda Gevra, Bhavana, and Balswa in Delhi provide service plots. Second, while the majority are built and managed by governments, a small but increasing trend, for example, in Ahmedabad, sees private builders using incentives provided by programs like the PMA to construct housing colonies on cheap peripheral lands for sale to low-income households. Privatized resettlement also occurs in Mumbai under the Slum Redevelopment Scheme, or SRS, where families who do not meet eligibility criteria for in situ redevelopment or those evicted for particular infrastructure projects are rehoused in peripheral resettlement tenements built by private developers. However, neither of these differences significantly alters the key dynamics of peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection that constitute, in my analysis, the phenomenon of urban resettlement as a specific mode of marginalization. So peripheralization. Geographic peripheralization is a paradigmatic feature of urban resettlement. Interestingly, scholarship on peripheral urbanization in India, which focuses on speculative investments in luxury townships, industrial estates, or high-end gated enclaves, has yet to contend fully with the presence of these large, formal, low-income housing projects in the metropolitan peripheries. But peripheralization here, I argue, is less a matter of physical distance from the city than about a relegation to lands of the lowest market value. Distances from the city may range from a few kilometers, as in Balswa, New Delhi, to over 50 kilometers, as in Chennai's Godapakam, although distances are increasing with new generations of resettlement colonies. But whether built by the state or by private agencies, resettlement colonies are always sited on poor quality lands prone to flooding, or abutting toxic facilities such as garbage dump yards or polluting industries. Particular zones historically denigrated for ecological or economic reasons become hubs that attract a clustering of such colonies. So in Chennai, the flood-prone marshlands on the southern edges of the city were designated as wastelands to facilitate their acquisition for resettlement. In Ahmedabad, traditionally working class lands in industrial zones east of the Sabarmati River saw the largest concentrations of resettlement housing. In Delhi, these colonies are clustered on the northwestern floodplains, which also host large garbage landfills. And in Mumbai, the marshy coastal floodplains of eastern M Ward, marked as no development zones, become a favored zone for siting resettlement tenements. Thus, the peripheralization of low-income housing is rooted in and contributes to a political ecology of differential value production in the city. And importantly, these peripheries, while isolated from the city, are not virgin territories. They're often already informally occupied by other subaltern settlers who then get dispossessed or further marginalized by the abrupt installation of a large housing project bringing thousands of families from the city. New boundaries take shape between local populations and the new settlers, producing hostilities and conflicts. Discrimination. Resettlement colonies across all Indian cities, whether tenement style or plot-based, state-built or private, manifest a consistently inferior standard of infrastructure and services, attracting terms like state-built slums or substandard settlements, a commonly used referent for slums. In tenement projects, nearly all studies point to problems with size and design, especially in the early generations of these projects. In Chennai, projects built in the early 2000s had unit sizes of 160 to 180 square feet, less than half of the recommended minimum size for low-income housing. Standardized designs yielded cramped quarters that radiated heat and blocked out light, both of these actually producing recorded health effects. And they provided no spillover space for the expanded households and the multiple functions that constitute low-income housing. In Chennai, then, a new generation of post-2010 resettlement colonies had, in response to widespread criticism of the earlier sites, improved many aspects of the build, including house sizes and internal design, and had provided in-house piped water, toilets, electricity connections, and elevators. Yet even here, as in most other resettlement tenements across the country, the poor quality of construction was evident in cracks in walls and ceilings, crumbling plaster, collapsing window bars, poor wiring, leaking pipes. A tragic recent incident on February 11th of a 4-story building in Delhi's Bhavana resettlement colony, which collapsed, killing 4 people, is actually unsurprising given this sort of general phenomenon. These buildings were unoccupied and heavily vandalized, and eventually they just sort of crumbled. Even more commonly recorded were stark inadequacies in basic services. As evictions are typically carried out in haste to clear lands for infrastructure projects, people are moved to them before they are complete. For resettled families, then the shock of evictions is exacerbated by being returned to conditions of less than basic amenities that they had struggled for years to overcome in their previous settlements. In Ahmedabad, a mapping of over 30 sites by Desai et al. Found that most were not connected to the municipal water and sewerage networks and received contaminated and unreliable water supplies through mobile tankers. Sanitation was through septic tanks that were not regularly cleaned, causing sewage overflows, stagnation, stench, and a chronic mosquito problem. This narrative was repeated across colonies in every city. In Balswa, Delhi, where over 4,000 families had been settled, it took over 15 years for piped water to arrive. The 15,000 tenements in Chennai's Kanagi Nagar lacked formal electricity connections for over 10 years after their establishment. Other public services, schools, childcare centers, health centers, ration shops, all included in their plans, were either absent, insufficient, non-functional, understaffed, or of inferior quality. Buildings intended to house these facilities often lay vacant and vandalized or were taken over by local musclemen for illegal activities. In most cases, infrastructure and services were gradually improved and augmented over long periods of time. But for vulnerable households, these years of disconnection from basic services and amenities carried long-term repercussions on their trajectories of urban advancement. And the third dynamic of disconnection, studies highlight multiple forms of disconnection which perpetuated or reproduced poverty and disadvantage in these sites. First, distance combined with poor transport arrangements to create spatial dislocation. Now, housing conditions are ultimately only of secondary concern to residents. The single most serious challenge is the disruption in livelihoods and education caused by their disconnection from the city. Unlike residents of informal settlements or urbanizing villages in the peripheries, resettled populations remain exiled and out of place for several years after the move due to their ongoing dependence on the city for work, education, healthcare, and social networks. Constraints to mobility result more from inadequacies in transport facilities than from distance. Across cities, residents reported insufficient or poorly connected bus routes, low frequencies of buses resulting in overcrowding, unreliable services, and inconveniently located bus stops. Those who could afford it used two-wheelers or auto rickshaws, but these options were strongly gendered, predominantly available to men. These mobility challenges then significantly raised the costs of workers' participation in the labor force, causing many, especially women, to drop out. For women, the challenges of running households in poorly serviced resettlement sites compounded their mobility challenges, accounting for low female workforce participation rates in all settlements, so quite dramatically low participation rates. Although some colonies are located near industrial or commercial centers, this did not bring sufficient or significant job opportunities, as most residents had worked as street vendors, domestic workers, or daily wage laborers in the city, and lacked the network skills or contacts to find employment in new sectors. Local employment was also often hard to obtain because of the stigma associated with the settlements. Almost all workers faced ruptures, ranging from a few months to several years in their occupational trajectories, and many had to rebuild their network skills and career paths from scratch. Many households now survived on a single wage, most had gone into debt, and many had to take their children out of school for both logistical and financial reasons. Many experienced dislocation from the city as de-urbanization. They spoke of no longer being in the city, being sent to a jungle. In Gudapakam, 50 kilometers from Chennai, residents severed from their urban lives talk about feeling ruralized and dependent. Young people missed the cinema, internet centers, and markets. Women contrasted their ease of movement in their city neighborhoods with their present conditions, where every trip required so much planning and expense that they simply opted to stay home. And a third form of disconnection specific to the tenement projects was the alienation of residents from processes of building homes and neighborhoods. The allocation of fully built housing units of standard design, combined with residents' heavy dependence on the state for basic services, and the poor quality of these services undermined their sense of ownership and inhibited their participation in what Appadare calls the production of locality. All resettlement colonies showed high rates of vacancy and turnover of housing as people informally rented out their allotments to return to the city. In Gudapakam, many families were separated for part of the week as male adults or students spent weekdays in the city. Now, safety emerged as a strong and consistent concern across all resettlement colonies. Threats to safety were multifaceted. Poor lighting in corridors and compounds, on access roads and streets made women and children feel unsafe moving around after dark. There were accounts of theft, illicit activities, and violent brawls at night that damaged buildings and vehicles. Alcoholism and drug abuse were described as rampant, including among children, and women hesitated to let their children play unattended outside. There were accounts of stabbings, killings, and attempted and actual kidnapping of children. In Chennai, high rates of child marriage were reported as parents saw this as a way to keep their daughters safe. Many families had left their children in the city due to unsafe conditions in these colonies. And these discourses of fear were interwoven with critiques of the heterogeneous social composition of these settlements. because in all colonies, patterns of housing allocation produced a random mixing of people from different slums, so that people who had lived together earlier were rarely rehoused together, and neighbors were strangers. The social diversity produced under these conditions was experienced as alienating rather than integrative, and contributed to disconnecting residents from their housing. Mutual mistrust inhibited collective action and hampered the transformation of projects into neighborhoods. So all of this suggests that despite the benefits of formalized tenure and status, the effects of resettlement can be characterized as a form of structural violence. Here I index both Galtung's definition of violence as a situation in which people are constrained from achieving their full potential, and Gupta's narrower definition that indexes outcomes of extreme suffering and deprivation. And of course, structural violence refers to violence that is impersonal, normalized, built into structures of power, and constant rather than episodic. Structural violence here, the way I talk about it, then encompasses both the immediate impacts of eviction and its losses, its disconnections and suffering, and the longer term effects of resettlement in curtailing the opportunities and mobility of households. But remaking the urban from the margins, residents rarely resign themselves passively to the object status of being resettled, and they've gone on to remake these places in different ways over time. Several studies have emphasized the role of temporality in accounting for the lived experience of resettlement and its changing meanings and affects at different moments in its longer trajectory. Early experiences, as we said, are shaped by the trauma of forced eviction, where the violent erasure of homes, relationships, and occupational pathways leaves lasting scars on the household's preparedness to and ability to rebuild their life. Yet, as the shock of displacement wanes and settlements develop, residents start shifting their energies to rebuilding. Now, in plot-based resettlement, this remaking is from the ground up, involving incremental auto-construction of built space from scratch in a formal space that is shot through with irregularities of titling, regulation, and governance. And studies describe how families invest heavily in building homes despite the tenuousness of their legal tenure, and how they display high degrees of initiative, improvisational skills, and resilience to do this. But in tenement-based resettlement, rebuilding comprises a raft of efforts by residents to address service inadequacies and secure the entitlements written into projects. For example, in Kanaginagar, it took residents more than 10 years of mobilization through protests, petitions, postcards, press campaigns, and partnerships with city-based housing activists and NGOs to secure improvements in services. In Balswa, New Delhi, the Right to Information Act was deployed vigorously by women residents to fight for better facilities. These projects of rebuilding and co-creation complicate the project of formalization as resettled populations turn to informal self-provisioning, for example, by tapping into electricity lines or agitating for their rights as they did in slums. In Mumbai's Vashinaka, the cooperative housing societies that were expected to manage and maintain the buildings like middle-class residents associations instead continued to negotiate with state agencies for services through political intermediaries, persisting in the mode of Chatterjee's political society. So the story of transformation in these colonies is complex and is told in different ways depending on the larger contexts of city and project governance, timelines, project design, and the influence of intermediaries. Experiences of remaking life after relocation vary by gender, generation, duration of residence, and by different micro neighborhoods within the colony. But all these accounts veer between tales of amelioration and deterioration, between accounts of significant improvements in living conditions over time, and narratives of intractable ongoing problems that trap residents into cycles of discrimination and disadvantage. So ambivalence and dualities is a crucial feature of experiences of resettlement in India. In Vashinaka, more than 10 years after occupation, the settlement was described as somewhere between a slum and a formal city. In Kanaginagar, 18 years after the colony was founded, most residents expressed a general contentment with current conditions, but many also pointed out that this satisfaction was founded on a comparison with past conditions and an overall resignation to lower standards of living. Several residents confessed that they would still prefer to move back to their old homes in the city slums. Indeed, for many, their goal was for their children to leave the place. Youth confessed that getting out of Nagar would both give them a chance of social mobility and indicate that they had achieved it. Thus, nearly 2 decades after its founding, Chennai's Nagar was still a place of uncertain transformation, where the visible enhancement of the built space was overshadowed by the persistence of crime and safety threats, enduring stigma, and limited opportunities for socioeconomic mobility. So rebuilding also produces fragmentation and difference within the neighborhood. The sites are full of stigma, which crafts a complex matrix of internal and external boundaries. In public discourse, there still remain slums, places of bad repute filled with thieves and drunkards, a reputation that still blocks youth from obtaining white-collar jobs in the vicinity. To state service providers, their residents are undeserving recipients of free or subsidized goods, incapable of bettering themselves. Internal stigma produces lines of social difference among residents, exacerbated by intra-site differences in types of buildings, levels and quality of infrastructure, compensation packages, etc., related to the different projects under which people had been resettled. In Vashinaka, for example, the newly settled residents of concrete buildings distanced themselves from the prior occupants of the sites who lived in slums nearby, and also from pavement dwellers who had been allotted housing in the new buildings. Thus, seen through the extended temporal frame of remaking urban space and lives at the margins, resettlement emerges as an anomalous and contradictory process, which scholars have captured these double-edged effects through terms like marginalized formalization, METH 2019, that index both the recognitions and the rights implied by this resetting of residents' relationships with the state, and the discriminatory experiences and everyday costs that this new relationship entails. The notion of graduated citizenship, Anand and Radhamaka 2011, marks the incompleteness of the rights to the city, but also the internal differences that result from the uneven distribution of resettlement compensation and the varied positioning of subjects vis-a-vis its benefits. Recent writings argue that a focus on the lived experiences of residents allows for a closer appreciation of these diverse experiences and open-ended outcomes of resettlement for differentially placed households. So building on these analyses of ambivalence and duality, I attempt to build a conceptual framework to understand resettlement in India. Despite the dominance of peripheral resettlement, there's been actually very little attempt to conceptualize it. Most scholarship has remained empirical, case-based, or at best comparative. So to start with, I argue that resettlement is a specific form of urban marginality, distinct from familiar forms like the slum, the unauthorized settlements, the village. Its point of departure consists in the fact that marginalization here is not produced in the first instance by neglect, abandonment, or policy failure, but rather by the systematic expansion of inclusionary state policies aimed at formalizing excluded populations and providing them a substantial welfare good. Now, how does this policy intent yield these outcomes of peripheralization, discrimination, and disconnection amounting to structural violence? First, I argue the modes and mechanisms through which formalization is operationalized in these marginal spaces renders it an incomplete and contradictory process, undercut by and actively producing informalities of various kinds. Multiple and sometimes contradictory motives drive the agenda of housing formalization through resettlement. For example, imperatives of reclaiming public lands for urban infrastructure converges with the goals of improving the housing conditions of slum dwellers, but often in practice takes priority over those goals. Pressures to clear slums within urgent timelines set by courts or by project proponents leads to compromises in norms and standards, producing conditions that mirror those of informal settlements and impelling residents into informal self-provisioning. In addition, the mass scale of these projects, the heavy state subsidies involved, and an underlying official ambivalence about whether these benefits are a public or a private good also undermines policy objectives of inclusion. And I argue that the task of conceptualizing calls for going beyond the perspective of lived experience alone and locating resettlement in the political economic structure of contemporary urbanization. Here I take a cue from Wacon's analysis of neighborhoods of relegation, in the post-industrial Western metropolis, as manifested in Chicago's ghettos and the Paris banlieues of the 1980s and 90s. Wacon's concept of relegation focuses inquiry not on the denigrated places or people, but on state policy, on what he calls new regimes of advanced marginality, wherein marginalization is not residual, contingent, or transitional, but is actively crafted by state policies and is rooted in the deep structures of financialized capitalism. So in India then, resettlement must be understood as the flip side of the world-class city-making agenda, the condition of its possibility. The resettlement colony is a crucial node in a politics of capitalist spatial restructuring based on a differential valorization of places and people, which relegates housing for the poor to distinctive peripheral zones marked by the lowest value lands. Seen then from the logic of state policy focused on urban resettlement, urban restructuring, resettlement embodies an agenda of differential inclusion and incorporation of excluded populations into the urban polity on formally unequal terms. It represents a settlement in the Latourian sense of a compact, here between a newly resolute and empowered bulldozing state and its objects, the property-less but politicized masses of India's political society. Analyzing Mumbai's housing schemes along these lines, Anand and Radamaka argue that the partial citizenship entitlements that settlers have won over time through civic mobilizations and political negotiations have shaped what they call a politics of compensation, in which they now compete for better terms. This has contributed to a condition in which, I quote from them, inclusion has supplanted equality as a guiding aspiration for urban development. I argue that state-sponsored resettlement in substandard colonies enacts a tiered inclusion that diverts or subverts or perverts the goal of equality and produces graduated, conditional, or incremental citizenship. So understanding resettlement then as a form of differential inclusion, driven by these dual exigencies of neoliberal urban transformations on the one hand, and political appeasement of excluded subaltern groups on the other, may explain the dynamic of peripheralization, but it does not fully account for the ongoing production of discrimination and disconnection in these sites. For this, I turn to anthropological analyses of the social production of indifference in state practice. Differential inclusion is held in place, I argue, and made possible by routinized everyday practices of bureaucratic indifference. So for Hertzfeld, indifference is produced through encounters between state bureaucrats and their clients, which mobilize categorical currencies of moral and cultural difference, building stereotypes of us and them that bureaucrats and their clients deploy on and against each other, building relations of patronage and their flip side, attitudes of indifference. Gupta invokes indifference to explain why India's vast package of welfare policies built on ethics of care and inclusion of economically excluded populations yields outcomes that are arbitrary and often violent. Bureaucratic indifference, in his analysis, is a form of structural violence built into mundane routines of rule, wherein discriminatory outcomes are not produced by indifferent attitudes of state functionaries, but by bureaucratic pressures of getting things done that constrain even the most sincere functionary. So in resettlement colonies then, bureaucratic indifference, as evidenced in the routinized under compliance of state agencies with service norms and standards, emerges from the exigencies of moving, settling, and serving large numbers of surplus urban populations on urgent timelines. But it also aligns with structural axes of discrimination such as class, caste, and gender, mapping onto the social status of these undeserving objects of state largesse. It is also shaped by contingent fault lines within the politics of a given time and place. So as Doshi shows, resettlement practices in Mumbai were shaped by a convergence in the 1990s between the growing grip of real estate developers and the new xenophobic and anti-Muslim ethos of the Shiv Sena party that had won power in Maharashtra. Then the production of marginality of people or of space begins long before displacement is conceived. Thus, resettlement does not begin and end with a project. So I'm going to conclude here about timing. I have tried to characterize urban resettlement in India as a specific mode of marginalization that builds inclusion through the differential and discriminatory incorporation of property-less populations into the metropolitan territory, producing a tiered urban order. So why does this framing matter, and what does it imply for politics and policy? First, the contention of a singular phenomenon yielding common effects of marginality across varied spatial and governance contexts urges against the assumption that these outcomes are attributed to poor implementation of particular projects. While specific aspects of implementation like design, distance, the adequacy and quality of everyday amenities do determine outcomes to some extent, it is the fundamental structure of peripheral resettlement as a strategy of unequal inclusion that is at stake in both political and intellectual terms. Nevertheless, I'd say the anomalous and open-ended trajectories of transformation that we see in these settlements do point to openings and opportunities for remaking these spaces in different ways. And here details matter. Decent transport, schooling, healthcare facilities, etc., hold potential for altering the dynamics of placemaking in these sites. And finally, the role of bureaucratic indifference and its social mappings introducing the marginality of resettlement calls for greater attention, both in scholarship and in practice. Thank you for listening to this longish presentation.
Thank you so much, Karen. This was fantastic. Really, really thought-provoking, rich presentation. So we'll open the floors for questions. So if people want to ask a question, we'll ask them to raise your physical hand or and ask in person or your virtual hand. And I guess we'll collect 2 or 3 questions and then let Karen answer them in a buckets of 2 or 3. I see Subha has a hand.
Subha.
Hi, Karen. So nice to see you here.
Hi. I can't see you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, for some reason I can't turn on my video. It's disallowed, but we'll schedule a call separately. Yeah. I guess my question would be, and thank you again, brilliant as always. Okay, I can start my video now. All right, awesome. Hi. So nice to see. Yeah, but Karen, thank you, brilliant as always. So I guess like my question here is, you know, do differing subnational or city level political dynamics or regimes or urban governance that are sort of nested within the overall neoliberalization of urban governance and urban development in India sort of pattern the logics and policies of resettlement across this city context in any way? Such dynamics, you know, they've been argued to matter for the distribution of public goods or the level of inclusion in politics more broadly across other domains. But here in the reproduction of logics of resettlement, they don't really seem to matter that much across city contexts, at least from what I can see. And or do they matter for the extent to which the politics of auto construction are allowed to re-emerge and persist over time? Like, and I know it's a work in formation, but that's like the I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. Shall I take that or wait for a few more? Does anybody else? I don't see a hand.
I see it. I see.
Yeah, Smriti Rao. Is that right?
Hey, my video doesn't actually work, so sorry, I can't put on my video. My name is Smriti Rao, and I teach at Assumption University. And thank you so much for that presentation. I actually have, my main question was going to be sort of how you understand the extent to which temporary or circular or precarious migrants are or are not included in the worlds of these settlements. You know, my sense is that this is largely, you know, as you pointed out, the resettlement of permanent migrants to the city. But I'm just wondering if you have a sense of whether the more precarious forms of migration, you know, those migrants are also traveling through or included in some ways in these, you know, settlements. And my second question is sort of, you know, you were just raising the question of, you were raising the point about how these resettlement colonies might be sort of absorbing surplus populations, right? So I was going to return to that, you know, constant question that all of us have, which is, are these really surplus populations? Or, is this marginalization, very specifically a way of ensuring a, labor force that is docile, that is cheap, that is, so it's very much integrated into the way that capitalism operates. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think since there are 2 or 3 questions here, maybe. Oh, Glenn, yes, take yours. Hi.
Hi, Karen, and thanks very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think Smriti's just kind of raised one of the questions that I was going to ask. I was going to ask, are there exceptions to this as a rule? I mean, I'm just thinking, the slight exceptions I've seen perhaps are BSUP housing within Kerala, where maybe the size of the problem is much less, and perhaps the state capacity in some ways, or the imagination of what these resettlement colonies could look like has been different. So there's something there perhaps about municipal level or state level capacity to reinvent national policy that might be of interest.
Yeah, so let me take these 3. I can see a couple more hands, but I think I'll lose my thoughts if I take too many. So I think in a way, actually, Glenn's question converges with Subha's about different regimes. Can you actually explain, I mean, do different sort of political regimes or urban governance regimes actually produce different outcomes or different patterns of implementing these? And I think they actually do, and I'm going to say to an extent. I mean, my argument is still, and I'm actually, honestly not familiar with the Kerala cases. This is, as I said, my work in progress really involves now having to search out the outliers to my arguments. But I think broadly in most of the other cases, there are differences in the, let's say, quality of implementation, I would say, and perhaps to some extent in the case of, and yeah, in a lot of details. For example, in the case of Chennai, I would say there is a more inclusive intent in the sense that they don't have cutoff dates of the kind that you see stringently applied in Delhi and Mumbai. In fact, in Chennai, they also resettle renters. Basically, they resettle anybody who can be found to be living in that house at that time, which then, of course, brings in a very interesting sort of negotiation between the owners and renters. Then there's all kinds of negotiations that happen between them so that one can claim the house. So I think that there is this intent, and I've seen conversations within the state that talks about how bad these places are and how it's really important when you're resettling vulnerable people to make sure that everything is in place and well run, etc. So I think there's a different and I think the Tamil Nadu state would like to be proud of these places. So they're, at least the facades are good looking. The senior officials are very, gung-ho about the fact they think they're doing a good job. What they're not in touch with is what's going on the ground. And therefore, I think that looking at bureaucratic indifference as also somewhere within bureaucratic practice is also an important part of this, because it's not all about just the intent and the sort of political economic policy intent. It's also at some level there. So yeah, there might be exceptions, but Glenn, but I'm thinking that given the larger sort of framing of resettlement is something that is working with the revaluation of urban land and the whole sort of liberalization of urban land, and having to then do something about the urban poor within that context. It seems to be something that will be inevitable in cities that are facing land pressures. So therefore, I'm saying metropolitan cities, maybe not the smaller cities, but Coimbatore going that way, Madurai going that way. I don't know if the big cities will go that way. So it is a problematic of land on the one level. And the second part of that is that I think it's also a problematic of mass standard provision. So in that sense, ghettoization, they somehow that sites and services approach of really building mixed integrated neighborhoods doesn't seem to be able to absorb the kind of mass scale thing that you want to do. And maybe that's where, Glenn, the difference is with Kerala, is that you're not having that kind of scale of need to send people out of the city yet. So that's to those two questions. Subha, I'm not sure about the politics of auto construction. I might come to that later. Smriti, the extent to which temporary migrants, well, they are not officially included in these projects, because these projects are supposed to serve slum dwellers who have been in the city for quite some time. But they do provide a fair amount of rental accommodation and actually cheap rental accommodation for short-term migrants. So in a lot of these colonies, you'll see a fairly large cohort of, say, Northeastern migrants, or basically interstate migrants or cyclical migrants who rent accommodation in them. And yes, I agree with you that this term I'm using of surplus populations is a tricky one. I am talking about the informal, precarious workforce that doesn't have, is not actually working in, big establishments in the city, that basically are, self-employed, vendors, carpenters, electricians, people like that, that are, right and now sort of living in slums, and that end up being out there unemployed because they're not going to any one establishment. Although I have to say that we've also found that resettlement colonies bring about informalization. A lot of formal sector jobs are lost, abandoned in this process. At least that's what we found in Kanaginagar in the beginning, is that there was a large switch from out of the formal sector jobs to the informal. So yeah, that's, I hope to some extent I've answered that. Subha, if you're asking about whether the informal sort of housing emerges around these resettlement colonies, I'm not sure. I think in Chennai they don't. The formal, settlements are kept very formal. There may be little extensions of houses and a little bit of outbuilding, but you don't see a big spread of auto constructed informal housing around and inside the settlements. Sorry. Okay. Sugata and Pooja are two hands I see here.
Brigu also. Brigu is there.
Hi, Karin. This is Sugata here. It's a, you really presented it so well with lots of data and all, and I congratulate you for that. My question is with regard to the nature of the population that you have taken into account. I would like to know, did you, by any chance you have taken into account the caste, class, gender and tribal issues with regard to the social adjustment process that these resettlement colonies are facing? Because I don't know how it's particularly, I would be interested to know about the tribal issues in case you had any tribals in those resettlement colonies, because they are already having these identity issues, identity crisis when they're having, they are having to migrate to these big cities. Your thought on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, but
maybe Pooja first. And
there's also Brigu there asking.
Yeah, Brigu. I can see two. Yeah, I was just going to say Pooja first because I saw her hand up first, and then Brigu. Pooja? Okay.
Not there.
Not there.
Yeah.
Brigupati?
Yeah, hi. I think that's it was a very
yeah. Since there was a point that you said that start settling in these resettlement colonies. There are a lot of tribal areas with tribal people who are forced to
Connect.
Your audio is not very good.
Can you maybe send your question in a chat?
And go to resettlements and things like these. Then there are questions of gender equality. Actually, it's a bit long question. Is it audible now?
Yeah, it's better.
Hello.
Can you start from the beginning again?
Yeah, I was saying that I am studying relationships, personal relationships in urban areas. There was this thing that you said that when the people are settled into resettlement colonies, they have certain kind of social mobility. And then there are many tribal groups which are urbanized by settling them in such colonies, and it gives rise to questions of gender identity, sexuality, and then the people get into a kind of equation of other people, of other urban people. So they always try to reclaim their identity. I think it's going a bit long. So my basic question is, are there any scholarly works in India which focus on what kind of relationships are formed in when people settle in such areas?
Okay.
Maybe I can write to you personally and you can provide me some readings or something of this kind.
Okay, although I don't really know about many of such works, but let me think about it a little bit. But Brigu, I'll take your question and then see if I can answer.
Yeah. Would you prefer to answer it and then I go after that, or should I just add my question to the mix?
Okay, I'll just answer both Pooja and
yeah. I'll just wait.
So Sugata quickly. So Sugata, I think that this is very much, I think, caste, ethnic kind of formation in a big way. I mean, to the extent that the urban poor in cities also tend to be largely groups that are, disadvantaged in terms of caste. You do find. So I think in Chennai, we found that more than 50% of any one resettlement colony would be scheduled caste people, a very large number of what we call MBCs, and groups like that. And so they are, in fact, in Tamil Nadu, they are calling this a new form of untouchability because of the kinds of dynamics that I described and that overlap with the sort of caste segregation of people. And I think the question of gender is huge. And I think a lot of resettlement writings really talk about gender and talk about the impacts on women. And that's a whole topic by itself. It is the group that has, I think, suffered the most with it. And you're going to find very large numbers of female dropouts from the workforce, a lot of domestic abuse, a lot of, like I said, child marriage, a lot of these kinds of outcomes from this phenomenon. Tribal, I have not actually come across a lot of tribal communities that are settled here. Actually, I haven't come across any in the resettlement colonies. I mean, we do have in Chennai, there are tribal groups that are settled in the city. They're settled in niches in the city, like the Narikurawa, groups. But none of them have been moved out to these resettlement colonies. So I actually don't know anything about it. And on those lines, Pooja, again, I'm not at all familiar with writings on tribal resettlement of the kind I'm talking about. There is some writing, not a lot, about relationships, social relationships, and how they get reformed in resettlement colonies. I'm not sure that's of the kind that you are asking about. Maybe you should write to me separately and I'll see whether I can, find some readings to help you.
Yeah, thanks, Karin. Thanks so much. And just if I may add one more question here. I mean, I missed your first or second slide. I wanted to know your time period of the study. The reason I'm asking you, did you find a difference during this pandemic period with regard to the social adjustment of these people?
Yeah, I mean, so the study was really, I've been looking at these places for the last 10 years, and most studies that I'm looking at were, the fieldwork was done before the pandemic. So, but I mean, I've been in touch with many of the resettlement sites during the pandemic, and I mean, it's been huge. The kinds of changes in their lives have been really dramatic. It would take a lot to talk about this now, and I don't want to really get into the thing, but I think the difference between what the resettlement colony residents suffered and those of other low-income neighborhoods in the city is something that we are studying now, and it is pretty dramatic. The ways in which they were cut off from the city, and the ways in which they, because it's such a huge settlement that in every disaster you see that they have, you know, a really unique kinds of impacts of being disconnected and being people cannot really help them much, because you're talking about 15,000, 20,000 households that any NGO cannot do much about, and the state sort of pretty much vanishes during those times. So yeah. Yeah, maybe we could go to Brigunapati now.
Thank you, Karen. Is it okay if I don't turn my camera on, because it's I'm at home with my daughter and she has a holiday, so I'd rather just concentrate on the question than the video. So I've been following your work and kind of the work on resettlement colonies more broadly, because I've been doing fieldwork for the last 5 years or so in one of the largest resettlement colonies in Delhi, Trilokpuri, which is a population of 170,000, sometimes called the Riot Laboratory of Delhi. And my basic proposition to you is that I wonder if there is a way in which such neighborhoods are written about that actually eclipses both the life worlds within them and how central they are to political formations, contemporary political formations. So just to push with the previous two questions, that if you look at the caste composition of such neighborhoods, then for example, in Delhi and other cities that I've focused on, it's often very much obviously a Dalit geography, but a specific kind of, so in Delhi, often municipal workers, so like Balmikis are the primary residents, that is MCD employees, Balmikis are the main dominant population in Trilokpuri, many other resettlement colonies. And the dynamic, which is really a national dynamic, is their shift from the Congress to the BJP over the last 10 years, which has been absolutely, over the last 20 years, which is basically how Modi is different in a way from Advani and Vajpayee, which was a much more upper caste formation. So in some ways, they've been absolutely central to national political formations, and in the local political worlds within such neighborhoods. I wonder if even Akhil Gupta and that kind of just the use of terms like structural violence, marginalization actually doesn't capture anything of the dynamic of what actually goes on in such neighborhoods. So I'll just give you my ethnographic example from the last interview I did before the lockdown, before the pandemic, was with the younger brother of the local Balmiki BJP MLA there, whose name is Bittu, who described the history of the neighborhood to me in terms of the cars that people owned there, and the different cars they had owned, and how many families within these 170,000 had owned cars. And he was very proudly saying how there are now 11 Skodas in Trilokpuri, Skoda being a big, ugly, vulgar SUV car. And he's one of the owners, and somebody defaced his car, his Skoda. And in order to prove his kind of continuing dominance as a big man, he set fire to the remaining 10 Skodas in the neighborhood. And this he described as sort of the dynamic of how things work in such a neighborhood. So I think to think of this as just subjugated, subaltern, marginal, structural violence, recipients of welfare or not quite, I think we eclipse basically a lot of the life centrality to national politics, and also the real local. I mean, this is a very violent example of setting fire to all the other cars, but these are the people who sort of began in the 1970s very much as marginal residents, as people who'd just been displaced from another part of central Delhi, Valmiki neighborhoods, and have emerged as really political strong men in a way. So I wonder if the literature, scholarly literature itself, is not serving to eclipse the kind of really central political phenomena in the country.
Can I add, Karen?
Sure.
Can I add to this this phenomenon that Brigu sketched for you? I'm also uncomfortable. I thought first of all your argument about ambivalence and duality and how resettlement is a new form of marginality, and how this marginality is connected to a formal project of inclusion. Now, I think these are terrific arguments. Really admired them. But But to push the point that further that Bhrigu is making, what if we don't conceptualize the outcome that we are observing here as a binary, marginality or being in the core, but as a graduated scale, that there are it's not two outcomes, it's more than two outcomes. So it's people who were absolutely marginal come to Trilokpuri and they were Valmikis, they're still Valmikis by caste, but they now have Skodas, right? Now, and they have Skodas or they have more commonly seen scooters. They have scooters instead of bicycles. And they might have what Partho and you are calling political society. They might have used political society and their votes to achieve some mobility, right? So this idea of some mobility, which may be, which can the phenomenon that Bhrigu presented to you, or what I'm saying, scooterization of the previously marginal who didn't even own a bicycle. This phenomenon, can it be captured in the binary of marginals, of margins and cores, of peripheries and cores, or do we need another graduated category, or either trichotomy or something more than trichotomy, to understand how this is happening and how to characterize this? So the idea that Bhrigu's Bittu Bhai or Bittu has a Skoda and he didn't own anything to his family 20 years ago, but he's still a Valmiki and still living in Trilokpuri, right? But there's a certain power and certain mobility is achieved. How do we think of those people? And my suspicion is I haven't come up with the quantitative estimate of this from our urban work. Our suspicion is that there's quite a lot of these people. It's not just Bittu in Trilokpuri. There's a lot of Bittus and there are a lot of Trilokpuris all over urban India. And just a thought about Kerala cities, someone raised that. One big difference between Kerala cities and Chennai. I worked in Chennai, I worked in Kochi, worked in Mumbai, worked in Ahmedabad. The one big difference between Kerala cities and these other cities is that it's very hard to find slums in Kerala cities. Very hard. If you want to think of this, try looking for slums in Kochi. Try and figure out where exactly they are. We spend so much time doing that. It is very hard to unearth, to find slums in Kochi. We did find two small ones, but anyway, so this is the idea about either trichotomizing the output, the outcome that you are analyzing, or making it a little more complicated to include the Bittus of Trilokpuri.
Yeah, or actually, sorry, so Karen, before you, could I just add one follow-up thought to this, so that, I mean, in terms of the framing of the question or what the thought at stake is, because I did want to also say that at the same time, following up on Ashu's thought, it isn't that there isn't a very sharp sense of boundaries as well. So it's not like resettlement colonies that it's just fluid. So right next to Trilokpuri, for example, is Mayur Vihar Phase 1, which is a middle-class neighborhood where lots of my colleagues live, like academic colleagues. And the idea of moving from Trilokpuri to Mayur Vihar Phase 1 is sort of impossible for people like Bittu. And including like one person I'd followed who was a Congress woman leader from Trilokpuri who moved to Mayur Vihar Phase 1, in fact. A Balmiki woman leader from the Congress, and how traumatic it was for her and her daughter and her husband. So in some ways, it is gradated, but I'm saying there are also still sharp boundaries, but I don't know how one would think of it as whether it's marginality or something else. But just to say what is eclipsed is also quite central in how these neighborhoods do participate in national political formations and the local political worlds that emerge within these neighborhoods. But thank you, Ashu, for following up.
Okay, so I think my response is in a few, has a few different things. The first one is that I got from what you were saying, Brigu, that Trilokpuri is an older, I mean, you talked about the 70s. And I do think there's a whole set of the resettlement colonies that came about after the emergency. Like, I mean, I've read Emma Tarlow's stuff on welcome and all of
exactly. So
yeah,
Emma Tarlow's stuff is also on Trilokpuri. They all settle in the emergency.
Okay, so so I am actually marking a different phenomenon. I'm marking the new generation of resettlement colonies, and I do think there is there are some clear differences among them. I mean, one of them being the kind of formally regulated project housing that is put in the new generation of resettlement colonies. So you know, in the work that I'm trying to, you know, propose through this sort of nationwide whatever profile, I'm making a boundary between the older resettlement colonies and the new generation that emerge around the 2000s. And one of the reasons for doing that is also because I mean I do believe we haven't got a full hang of what goes on there. You know, 20 years later, 40 years later, what are they going to become? I think that is really an open question. It is something that people are tracking. And I want to then therefore come to a second part of the answer that I want to give you, which is that I completely agree with you about the dangers of the kind of generalization I'm trying to make. And I think in general, I want to flag also a very sort of the tricky methodological aspects of trying to study a resettlement colony for various reasons. One, because they are, at least the ones in Chennai, are pretty large and segmented and have many different realities going on in there simultaneously based on when people were settled, but also, you know, there are new populations who buy and come in, and then there are people who sort of have not been allotted but purchased and come in, which means there's a different kind of motivation coming in here. They haven't been evicted and relegated there. So there are all of these things. Secondly, how to deal with the issue of temporality, how to study what life was and where they are now, and you know, that trajectory, which I think is quite tricky. And the third is, I really think that without very, you know, good, deep ethnographic work, it is hard to, and even with ethnographic work, you can only tell part of the story. So I feel that there are serious methodological challenges to trying to capture resettlement colonies in the way that I've been trying to do. But so I'm just drawing the boundaries that I am, which is about temporality, and that the phenomenon I'm talking about is the newer generation of resettlement colonies that can be described in particular ways that are distinct from the welcomes and all of those. But the third thing in response to Ashutosh is that I am not actually conceptualizing marginality as the counter to the core, or like the core periphery construct. I'm more using the sort of, you know, the way that Veena Das writes about the state and its margins, the idea that this is a space in which you get to see the state reform itself. Or you get to see the mainstream actually play out in distinctive ways that are in slightly different ways, reinvent, you know, the way that the urban, that's why I'm saying the way that the urban is remade in these spaces that are marginal, not because they're the opposite of the core, but because there are distinctive, you know, kinds of relations of governance, etc., that go on there. So I'm looking at, so there's not an absolute distinction between the margin and the core, but there is a sort of, the margin is a space where things are unfolding in, I think, very open-ended ways, which are very useful lenses through which to think about things like the larger phenomena that are unfolding, like urbanization and the urban itself, different kinds of urbanism, whether and, you know, back to Brigu's thing, where there are particular kinds of ceilings that are taking place. So I mean, the marginality, I think, for me, comes from the fact that there are from a number of different boundaries that intersect here. I mean, there's the, and you know, back to also your question about politics. I think I'm starting to see, for instance, in Kannagi Nagar, which is has been around for 18 years, has now been incorporated into the city boundaries, etc. A whole new set of political equations, political kinds of calculations, and different ways in which you know, slumlords and other forms, other kinds of people involved in all kinds of different transactions in the city, also criminal networks, etc., are taking power there. But then there are also very, let's say, powerful progressive politicians who are transforming the physical landscape of these places. So I think the kinds of things that are unfolding as you get to, you know, later points when they get incorporated into politics are very different from, let's say, I've seen other resettlement colonies like Perumbakam and Gudapakam, which are less than, they're about 5 or 6 years old, where all of the stuff I was talking about you know, being really, you know, dispossessed and displaced and all of that is unfolding. So I think the temporality is something that we need to maybe think about more systematically. Yeah, that's.
Yeah. So just one more thought there, 2 more hands up, and we have 4 minutes. I think what Brigu's trying to say, which I fully support here, is that the concept of structural violence, or the way Akhil has analyzed the problem, it collapses too many things that need to be differentiated. And here is one way to think about that. Can we think about mobility from the margins, a mobility that does not migrate into the core, right? Where is that space? How to conceptualize that space? It's no longer the old form of marginality, or is it? No, but it's certainly not. It's certainly not entering Mayur Vihar. It is not. It is still remaining in Trilokpuri. Certainly not entering Mayur Vihar. So very good, very good. Yeah. So let me just stop there. Brigu can add that. So where is that space? That middle, some kind of middle space. It is not exactly the old margin. It's not exactly the core, right? This is where. Brigu, go ahead.
And yet one can't understand Modi without Trilokpuri in some ways, I feel.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's really key. I think what you're talking about, the kinds of new kinds of politics and subjectivities that are forming there, and I think that's really understudied. I don't think there's enough, but again, I think you can do that only with a place that's long settled and has you know, there's been a sort of a sedimentation of the kinds of relationships that are forming there. On the other hand, the questions you're asking, Ashutosh, about mobility, I would in fact argue that it's a new kind of, almost a new kind of center in the periphery. Because if you start looking at the kinds of changes that the resettlement colonies are creating for the other urban poor, urbanizing villages and urban slums around them, they are a new form of a center. And therefore, I do think that there are many, you know, kinds of boundaries and crisscrossing that are happening out there. They're certainly not, you know, the center, the sort of duality of the center periphery that I'm talking about here when I'm saying margins. And that's why I'm saying a new kind of marginality that is forming a new social geography and new forms of institutional kinds of governance in these spaces. But, you know, the point I really take from you, Brigu, is that not many people have got a good handle on the sort of caste and political kind of dynamics that are unfolding out here, you know, ethnographically. Yeah.
Thank you. But really a fascinating project, and thanks so much for.
Yeah.
So do we have time to take?
We just have time for maybe one question, or yeah, we just have 1 minute.
Okay.
Sangeeta?
So I'm going to keep it very short, guys. I just want to say that, you know, big fan, like your work has been very foundational in, you know, like conceptualizing my own work, etc. But I want to take you to Chembur, you know, Chembur and like the Sindhi colony, and which is basically like, you know, which was formed as a kind of a refugee settlement in the early periods of, you know, as the city was developing. And then like very close to the Sindhi colony is where Lalubhai was essentially created in 2003. Lalubhai, you mentioned it in your slides. It was like created, 65 buildings were built in 2003, but in 2020, the landscape of Lalubhai looks significantly different. And this like addresses directly the questions about temporality and how do we essentially think about these like very dynamic places in the city, differentially. I also actually wanted to ask or even address the question of the variegated nature of the state spaces that govern these places, right? So, when the BMC, when the MMRDA essentially plonked Lalubhai in the middle of M East Ward, the BMC had absolutely no idea how they were going to manage this like extremely large population coming in from the various parts of the city to, and like who they couldn't provision for. The MMRDA hadn't given them the funds, nothing, right? So I actually want you to kind of respond one to the question of like this indifference that like Akhil Gupta talks about, right? Then this kind of like structural violence that dictates the way in which these spaces come to be and the marginality that is produced, and the role of the various different kinds of actors and brokers that ultimately are able to, kind of produce a space for such populations in these cities. So I'm not sure if you're aware of Lisa Bjorkman's latest book, The Waiting Town. In that she kind of like,
I haven't read it.
Sorry?
I haven't read it, I said.
Yes. In that she kind of like, shows Sparks like very complicated role in this like resettlement process, and how there were like a variety of different like brokers that essentially emerged to kind of produce these life worlds within these colonies, right? And also like their important role in the way in which like basic resources are secured and just everyday life is produced. So, and what I essentially mean to also say is that they have this like, this middle space, right? That this middle space of brokerage that exists in these parts of the city, in the ghettoized parts of the city, so quote unquote, which these ghettos have moved and like shifted across, right? And so how do we like think about state space and different state actors in lieu of brokers and like fixers, essentially? That's essentially my questioning. This like frame of structural violence and indifference and arbitrariness of the state like doesn't like account for these actors, which I would love to hear hear you think about essentially. Thank you.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely that's a really, really great question. Again, I would say a lot more needs to be done on that. I mean, I feel like every time I've worked in these spaces, I get a sense of all of these people, these brokers, these processes, and in the older resettlement. Again, I'm going to say that studying something like Lalubhai or Kanagi Nagar, which are 17 years old, 18 years old, have had a chance to kind of get entrenched and these things start happening, you get a very, very different feel about them. And I think the feel does come from that you're talking about, the sort of intermediate spaces of power, sort of these different power negotiations that are going on over there, and that I feel that it takes quite a bit of solid ethnographic work to capture, precisely because these are whole worlds there. I mean, when you're talking about a settlement of a lakh of people, to just get a hang of the kinds of power dynamics, so you end up going to, even if you're doing ethnography or whatever, you end up with a few sort of nodes where certain kinds of actors are you are getting those kinds of stories. But there's all of these interstitial spaces and so many things to account for that I think you've captured very well when you talk about the brokers and what is the role of the state. I mean, obviously, the state just, I mean, we've been talking to a lot of the state actors who are also working through people who live in there, because the state is completely clueless as to how to penetrate these areas. They're just like, they need to keep creating these links through different people to just be able to operate, which is also what the state does in these places, and they operate through these brokers. So I think that's, and I agree that talking just about bureaucratic indifference doesn't capture it, but I am still trying to account for this whole question of why for 10 years after a settlement like this is formed, they still remain badly underserviced when they are formal projects of the state. And I think that these informal operators don't account for that, as they would account for in urban slums. Because at least some of my work on the urban slums, you get to learn that it is actually the political party people who don't allow the taps to come, who want to keep a hold of the the water tanker business, etc. That doesn't, at least in the ones in Chennai, and I feel like I'm not really sure about the others, and I need to, this is the project I want us to get a lot more close studies on some of these questions from other areas. But I don't think that kind of informality of providers operates as much in this new generation of resettlement colonies. But that's why I'm still looking at the state as somewhere steering these projects, at least for the first few years.
I'm sorry, like one last comment. I just would like to add to that. In Bombay specifically, I think the problem is the fact that it's like market-based instruments that are essentially dealing with the resettlement colonies. So it's not just the state per se, but it's the market that's dictating the terms.
Yes, and so I think Amita Bidey's recent work about Mandala actually deals quite a bit with some of these questions about various actors who are sort of, crisscrossing this domain. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we ran out of time, went over it, but this was wonderful talk and wonderful discussion. So I'm really grateful for Karen for coming here virtually today. So let's clap.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you, Eva, for getting this going, and thank you very much for this audience and really great questions that have really made me think.